It's time now for Explain and Verify. South Africa is home to several major ports. That's Durban, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth and Richards Bay. And this week we saw President Cyril Ramaphosa on a two-day oversight visit in the Eastern Cape and the port of Ngqura specifically. All right, now let's take a look at some of what in fact is found. And someone who was on the ground was none other than Samgele Maseko.
Well, Bongiwe, indeed, President Ramaphosa embarked on a strategic oversight to the visit to the Eastern Cape province this week as part of his ongoing program to strengthen cooperative governance and accelerate infrastructure-led economic development across the country. The Port of Ngqura, which opened in 2009, is South Africa's newest deep water port and offers a modern infrastructure that supports rapid container throughput, bulk handling and specialized maritime services. It is the proximity to the Ngqura Special Economic Zone, which hosts a wide array of manufacturing and logistics enterprises, makes it a cornerstone of regional and national development planning. Bongiwe, that particular Port of Ngqura, as we go to our particular slide, which I will explain more on this Port of Ngqura. We've got a port in Richards Bay Coal Terminal, which was largely problematic, particularly noting that it had a huge backlog of South Africa's exports of coal into the international markets, particularly into the Asian market, where China is one of the biggest importers of South African coal to Europe and also to other countries. You know that the current administration in the United States of America is in pursuit of fossil fuels. South Africa's fossil fuels in particular, our abundance of coal reserves are needed by international countries and international markets as they fire up their coal power stations. To just take into example, one country, Germany, that has restarted its own coal-based power stations as they had that particular turf with the shortage of gas with that war between Ukraine and ultimately Russia, with gas not flowing to other countries, particularly in Europe. Then that particular port had a backlog. The president had to go to that particular coal terminal in Richards Bay to try and see if Transnet coal terminals can try and solve that particular backlog that is currently there in Richards Bay. They have improved significantly since the president's visit last year, but they are not at the scale and pace that they should be at, which moves directly to the rail freight of Transnet that is currently at a backlog. You know that rail infrastructure was largely destroyed during the COVID-19 pandemic. That needs to be fixed. As with Operation Vulindlela, you've got private sector players that government is calling in to come and operate that particular freight of their own locomotives to try and use the rail infrastructure. That will be fixed by Transnet in the 2-3 financial years that are coming within the country. Then you've got the Durban port as well. Has a lot of backlogs within that particular port. The president had to go on a helicopter ride, viewing the number of vessels that were waiting to dock at that particular port as well. It has faced a number of leadership deficiencies over the course of the years, and there is a proposal to move the Transnet terminal business to the Eastern Cape, which is an issue that the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Oscar Mabuyane, is fighting vigorously with the Department of Transport, particularly when it comes to that particular part of Transnet, that division that manages the terminals within the country, to move to the Eastern Cape, particularly in the Ngqura port, where a magnificent building has been basically built where the president was, and those particular executives need to move to that Port of Ngqura, which will bring more business into the Western Cape, or rather the Eastern Cape provincial government, which Oscar Mabuyane says that the Transnet businesses must not be concentrated in one particular province. It must move across the country, particularly in the coastal belts of the country, to create jobs and to ignite the economy of those particular provinces. Bongiwe. Then you've got East London. East London is where largely those vehicles that are manufactured in that particular part of the country. One manufacturer that sent a message to the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Oscar Mabuyane, complaining that if the tariffs that are proposed by the United States of America, 30%, is imposed, it will have a severe impact to that particular German brand's manufacturing plant or assembling plant that is there within East London, that will affect the jobs of that particular area, which will further perpetuate poverty, unemployment and underdevelopment within that poor province of the Eastern Cape. Then the most interesting one, Ngqura, that is our deepest sea port that we currently have, that was opened in 2009. And that port essentially sees transversals that come from Richards Bay, Durban, that can't dock within these two particular ports because either they've got deficiencies, there's some problem with those particular port, or they can't dock in Port Elizabeth. They are then diverted to Ngqura, which is a deep sea port, which allows bigger vessels to dock at that particular Ngqura port. Then ultimately you have Mossel Bay, you have Cape Town, and you've got Saldanha. But the most interesting debate about these particular ports, particularly Saldanha, Cape Town, Mossel Bay, Durban, and East London and Port Elizabeth, is the debate of the Democratic Alliance to say these particular ports must not be managed at a national level. The provinces must have the authority to manage these particular ports on their own. It is a debate that is raging between political formations at this point in time. It is a debate that many within the dominant political formation or the majority political party in Parliament, the African National Congress, are seemingly against that proposal of the Democratic Alliance. I know that I said it last week that Mtumzeni Ntuli, the chief whip of the ANC, basically refused to sign a document of the Democratic Alliance or to agree with the Democratic Alliance when it came to the cessation, basically, of the ports from national and decentralizing them and taking them to the provinces. Bongiwe.
And Samgele, you think about, while the debate rages right around who should manage these ports, and at the same time you listen to the president speaking about some work that has been done to ease congestion when he looks at some of the country's ports. You think about Richards Bay, for example, which continued to be a problem for quite some time. But there have been issues at these particular ports that we've also seen over time.
Indeed, Bongiwe, for instance, if you look at the port of Durban, it is in the main container port on South African coastline, while handling approximately 60% of South Africa's container traffic. The port serves KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng region, and a large portion of inland southern Africa. So, for instance, that particular Durban port that we're speaking about, this port in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, it is ultimately the gateway into Africa. It is a gateway into the SADC region. It serves many countries within the SADC region. You do know that when trucks are being burnt or stopped on the N3, it has a severe impact on those SADC countries that use the Durban port, particularly on that N3 belt, to export many of their goods. Those particular goods have had to be diverted to other countries. I know the Port of Namibia has become very prominent to other SADC African countries with the deficiencies that are there within Durban, and in particular that N3 line around Escourt, so on and so forth, and Moy River, where those particular trucks are burnt at times or where there are strikes. Then the Port of Richards Bay is positioned as the bulk port of choice in the southern African region. It is currently 13 deep water berths in operation and handles 8 million tons of brick bulk and 20 million tons of bulk product per year. That is where ultimately your coal is shipped out, mainly within that particular port of Richards Bay. Then ultimately you've got Cape Town, South Africa's second biggest seaport, and its strategic location ideally positions it as a hub terminal for cargo to South America and the Far East, particularly noting how that particular South American country, remember that the former leader of the Democratic Alliance, Tony Leon, was an ambassador to Argentina for South Africa. The DA has been very vocal about wanting full control of that particular port of Cape Town, knowing its significance to South America, Far East, West and East Africa cargo has grown substantially.
And Samgele, when you look, of course, now we are at the challenges that are facing the ports, but I'm hoping that we move on to the third slide very quickly and look at the infrastructure challenges that continue then to plague some of these ports. And you talk about the fact that right now we're speaking about, the resources that need to move at quite a huge level, consignment and all of that, but you still have critical infrastructure issues.
You've got critical infrastructure issues that are facing Transnet as a whole and South African ports. Many of them are largely outdated. The infrastructure that they're using is very outdated. If you were to compare the port of Peru which is newly built by the Chinese government for the government of Peru as well, and you look at the Port of Ngqura, very similar. But if you look at Durban, Richards Bay, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth and Mossel Bay and Saldanha, they are largely very much outdated. You need to modernize this particular infrastructure that you have. Then you've got the rail infrastructure that largely transport this particular cargo. For instance, if you look at how cargoes that has been transported by freight by Transnet has decreased since the COVID-19 pandemic, with the dilapidation and the vandalization of public infrastructure, particularly rail infrastructure across the country as a whole, with Transnet and Metro and PRASA being largely affected. That needs to be modernized. It is in the plans of Transnet, particularly in the next 2-3 financial years, to make sure that they improve that particular rail infrastructure and bringing in public and private sector players in order to build, operate and transfer some of that infrastructure that government solely daily needs in order to improve infrastructure investment within the country, increase capacity throughout the country, improve turnaround times for vessels. This becomes very important because in Richards Bay, Durban, there was a huge backlog 2 years ago of these particular vessels. The president had to go on an oversight visit to Richards Bay and to the Durban port. They have reduced the number of vessels waiting to dock within those particular ports, but much more still needs to be done. Enhance connectivity between ports and rail networks. This is where South Africa falls short heavily at this point in time. We've got a huge, vast network of rail infrastructure that is not working, that needs to be fixed by Transnet and the South African government, which is where the Democratic Alliance comes in on its proposals of Operation Vulindlela and wanting to co-chair or chair Operation Vulindlela, which will ultimately see private sector players being brought in order to fix the infrastructure of rail within the country, to reduce the number of trucks that are transporting goods across the country. If you remember back in the days, Transnet, Spornet, they would ultimately transport the vehicles that are being imported into the country. They would get on freight rail and be imported or be essentially moved into the country using rail. But this time around, you've got a lot of trucks that are moving vehicles from the coastal belt of the country to inland of the country, as opposed to using rail, which has become very dilapidated within the country, which is one of the passion points of the current president of the country, to say fix rail, and that will improve the economic development and the economy of the country, and will ultimately create jobs. But as you've seen over the years, the trucking business has become a huge arbiter to government trying to fix that rail infrastructure. If you were to look at an area from Opongolo going to the Richards Bay coal terminal, that particular rail belt is not working because it has been vandalized. So coal that is ultimately being brought from Mpumalanga, from parts of Limpopo and parts of the Free State province to that Richards Bay coal terminal, they have to use trucks. As soon as you got to Pongolo, they have to offload them from the rails because the rail infrastructure is dilapidated, and trucks have to take that particular coal to the coal terminals, and hence the high number of accidents you've seen in those northern parts of the country, in particularly Pongolo. Remember, in Richards Bay coal terminal, you had about 50-60 trucks waiting in queue, waiting to go and offload at that particular coal terminal, which you've seen the trucking companies, if you've got 2-3 trucks transporting coal to that particular terminal, you end up losing lots of business because your truck ends up spending about 7 days waiting to offload.
And of course, Samgel, as you say, the debate continues to rage, even among those who are the players here in this particular industry. But definitely one thing's for certain: infrastructure needs to really be improved as speedily as possible. And of course, that was Samgele Masego. They're looking at the state of the ports and the improvements over time, but also some of the bottlenecks that still continue to plague this particular sector.